Well, hello, hello,
Hello, hello. Happy Wednesday from Los Angeles, California.
and happy Thursday morning from Sydney, Australia. I'm Leanne,
And I'm Jason.
and this is Let's Talk. This is a space where no topic is off limits, where we'll discuss things from well-being and resilience, leadership, money, relationship, mindsets, and so much more.
As always, here at Let's Talk, we bring different perspectives, real stories, and honest conversations because the things we don't often talk about end up being the things that really matter most to us.
So, our goal here is simple it's to spark new ideas, to shift your mindsets, and to give you practical tools that you can use in your leadership and your life. Your leaf, you can use it in your leaf, Jason. Leadership and life. That's what I was
Leadership
trying
in
to
life.
say. That's it.
So, whether you're tuning in for inspiration, growth, or just a fresh perspective,
Let's talk.
let's
And our
talk.
let's talk. And our topic today is really near and dear to my heart. It's about cultural well-being and what it means to really embrace the tapestry of humanity. Because cultural well-being is not about um, just food festivals or celebrating different flags or celebrating differences. It's about truly understanding our shared humanity across cultures, across beliefs, and across experiences. And this kind of enriches our lives to the extent that we can't even understand. It expands our worldviews and it deepens the ability to have empathy, seeing the self in others and finding that unity for all of us. So, really rich topic that we're going to be discussing today, Jason.
Yeah. And I love that empathy and unity part, Leanne, because I think it just speaks so well into everything also that we've talked to in our previous episodes up to this point. Um, and it's really about being a part of something bigger, right? And having that worldly global view. So when we see our differences not as barriers, but as these beautiful threads that, weave together the fabric of who we are and create that unity that you were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when we can understand and appreciate the diversity in all of us and the richness that brings in. So we don't just connect to others, we evolve ourselves, we evolve our families, we evolve our lives. And when we can have that unwavering positive regard, like actually assuming and believing that everybody is doing the best that they can in this very moment. And I want people to have that positive regard for me and I want to
Mhm.
offer that for other people as well, because we're human beings having a human experience with training wheels on in this thing that we call life, right? We're all doing the best that we can, given where we're at any particular time and day. So that unwavering positive regard, like actually looking for the good in people and assuming that they're doing their best, I think that is the key to happiness.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, really thinking about it like, post COVID and just in this VUCA world that we live in, um, like I think that really says a lot when we're doing the best that we can. And I think that level of self-awareness that we bring into that is so important. And when you acknowledge that and when you actually lean into just that self-awareness and like I think you said like a couple of episodes ago, like lifting the rug, right? And kind of like looking under there and saying, okay, yeah, like I'm doing the best that I can. And right. Um, so with that, today we'll explore how curiosity about others reduces bias and how cultural humility opens our hearts and how we can all use our privilege because we all have privilege in different ways to give back and build a more connected and compassionate world.
Yeah, and bias is a big topic that we'll kind of dive into today because bias is one of those things that we assume is bad. But
Hmm.
bias is actually a shortcut. It actually allows us to function well. It's just when it gets in the way of our humanity that it creates
Yep.
problems, right? Or if it gets in the way of our decision making, if it gets in the way of how we hire people, if it gets in the way, it's not good. But generally, bias is actually a shortcut in the brain that allows us to work effectively. So, used well, it supports us, and used well unconsciously, let's say that when it's unconscious and we're not aware of it, then it can create
Mhm.
so much division. So I think it's a really rich topic that we'll be looking at today, specifically around this concept of bias. We can't take bias out of people. David Rock from the Neuro Leadership Institute says if you have a brain, you have bias. So we
Yep.
all have. So we can't take it out of people, but we can take it out of our systems. We can take it out of our cultures. We can take it out of our teams in the workplace. There's ways that we can navigate it so it doesn't get in the way. And so we can actually connect humanity in a way that actually is of service rather than division.
Yeah, and something that I want to tag on to that is that, you know, I love what David Rock said, if you have a brain, you have bias, right? And we all get triggered, you know, like even like probably some listeners, right, when they hear bias, they get triggered a little bit for whatever reason. But it's the reframe that you put around it that is like incredibly important. And that's like where the magic really happens if you allow yourself to reframe what you're being triggered on when you say that word.
Yeah. And that comes back to that curiosity piece that we've been talking about almost in every session. Like, it is such a emotionally intelligent, useful skill, this skill of curiosity, and that self-awareness. Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah. So when we look at cultural well-being as strong and it helps our communities thrive, there's also inclusion, mutual respect, and a shared sense of purpose. But when cultural well-being is weak, we see isolation. I also kind of see isolation as being in a silo, right? Misunderstanding, and sometimes even in conflict, which I think that, we saw that, back during the pandemic with different events here in the United States. I think we saw that a lot. That's when I think we were operating around bias or not bias, I'm sorry, cultural well-being in a silo. There was so much isolation with that, but then also COVID, so many misunderstandings, and just so much conflict that was like so avoidable. And maybe that's the lens that I'm looking at it through, um, because people were letting their triggers control the narrative versus that reframe that I was talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting thing that you put there because I often say an inactive mind is the devil's playground. So if we're not surrounding ourselves with people, if we're not doing things effectively, if we're kind of stuck in our head, then all the stories kick in, all the stuff kicks in. And I think COVID was terrible for that because
Mm-hmm.
people were so isolated. They didn't have the interaction. So then they were listening to their committee, as we like to call it, the itty bitty shitty committee that kicks in. And I'm not saying um, that it was all true or not true because everybody has their own filter and their own lens. And that's not what we're here to discuss today. Today, it's really
Yeah.
about defining what it means to have this idea of cultural well-being. It's about
Mm-hmm.
feeling seen, feeling respected, feeling valued, both within your own culture and across culture. It's the sense that who you are and where you come from actually matters. And we are humans. Like we all matter. There is nothing in this world or nobody who doesn't matter. We all matter. But do we feel like we're seen? Do we feel valued? And do we feel like we matter? And do we actually acknowledge ourselves and actually have that for ourselves? Do we feel that we are of value? So some of it's an inside job, right? As well as what's coming at us from an external point of view. And from a neuroscience perspective, connection across different differences actually activates the same brain regions as
Mm-hmm.
safety and belonging. So this whole idea of connection is so important to us biologically. Our brain literally releases oxytocin when we're connecting, which is that bonding hormone. And when we experience acceptance and empathy, all of those good feelings come up, right? When we experience being accepted, and also when we accept others, we get those feel good chemicals as well. So it's a double-edged, I was going to say sword, but it's not a sword. Like it's that double benefit, right? Of
Yeah.
not only do I feel accepted and feel good because I feel accepted, but by accepting others, I also feel good because I'm getting all of that feel good chemical.
Yeah. And just I love how we have so kept our promise to our listeners that we will be intentional about always bringing in the neuroscience part because there's so much to learn, even if we just give those little nuggets, for people just to kind of percolate on throughout the week, till our next episode. So I just wanted to, acknowledge how we continue to be intentional to bring that neuroscience lens in for folks and to really give our listeners kind of that expansion of how the brain is involved in all this, from a neuroscience point of view. So I just want to say that it's fascinating. And
Oh, my sweet spot. I love it.
yes, yes. Um, and and with that, it means the more that we expose ourselves to diversity as a whole, the more that our brain learns to kind of be in that relaxed state, have that trust and that connection, which I think connects to that empathy, right? Because we're more out of our way when relaxed, trusted, and connected, and and to really foster that unity that we talked about just a few minutes ago.
Yeah. Because cultural well-being is about empathy, right? But it's as much as about mindset as it is about social construct. So,
Mm-hmm.
like I keep saying, it's an inside job, right? It's about us expanding our awareness and stepping out of the us and them mindset and moving more into the we and us. So it's not, them, it's we, it's us. It's like this connection piece. And I know for a fact, like, again, I'll bring in some neuroscience around this. When we feel like we belong, when we feel like we're connected, we actually live longer, right? Our
Mm-hmm.
brain releases these chemicals. It feels good. When we feel like we're not part of a team, when we feel like we're not connected, it actually creates stress, cortisol, which are the stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline. And that actually has our brain feeling like we're in fight or flight. So our
Yep.
brain likes people that are like us, generally speaking, because it finds it easier to navigate that space. But it's not the smartest thing, right? We know that the more diversity we have, the smarter collectively we are because we're like so many perspectives. So, again, this mindset of it feels safe with people like me is actually creating more problems because we're not as smart because we're not looking at the broader picture as a society as a whole. So I
Yeah.
think, going from them to us is really the key.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it just kind of makes me think about like our episode with PJ, right, on physical well-being and kind of talking about, those stress hormones and, what that does to the body and just, when you're in that state, right, how it affects your physical well-being, how it affects your emotional well-being, how it affects your mental and intellectual well-being, and then your core. So, it's just this continuous weave that we're seeing in our conversations, right, of how it's all connected, um, at a human level and a human experience level. Um, so thank you for that insight that you even created for me, Leanne, when you were talking about that. Um, so, a question that we want to ask our listeners: is when have you felt most connected to a culture that is different from your own? I'll read that again. When have you felt most connected to a culture different from your own? Maybe it was during travel, which I've experienced a lot in my global travel. I'm sure you have too, Leanne.
I'm a global
Um,
citizen. That's what I call
Me
myself, a
too.
global citizen.
Maybe it's through friendship. Sometimes when I look at my friendships, like sometimes I'm like, I have more friends that are non-white than I do friends who are white. So it could be, like I said, through travel, through friendship, or even on a shared project. That could be at work, that could be through volunteerism, that has changed your perspective. So percolate on that question over this next week and just see what insights come up for you.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up because, like you, Jason, I come from a very multicultural family. And I say multicultural because it's real. My family came on a boat to Australia like most people did. We've got a Maltese ethnic background. We've had married into the family African Americans. We've had Pacific Islanders. We've had Europeans. We've had true Australians. We've had this broad range, but not just that. Then also religions, right? Like you come into it, in my family, we had Catholics, we had reborn Christians, Jehovah Witnesses, Muslims, we had Judaism religion, all within our family culture. So when we came together and people took a shot of our family, no one believed that we were actually family because we were this tapestry of humanity coming
Yeah.
together. And so when you ask this question about when have you felt more connected to a culture, like every day for me, because if I look at the people that I hold nearest and dearest, we're all a mixed bag of lollies, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Or as what is it, the mixed box of chocolates that Forrest Gump talks about, you know,
Right.
like really at the end of the day, there is this mixture. And because of that, there's so much richness. The foods that come together at our family dinners and the experiences and the traditions that come in, the formalities that sometimes can divide but also connect. It's been a really interesting thing. And because of that, I have this absolute love for all of humanity. Like,
Yeah.
I absolutely do, and it makes no difference to me, but I know that um, and if anything, um, I wouldn't have it any other way. Like, I really would not have it any other way. So
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the diversity, for the differences, because it has expanded and evolved my mind in ways that I couldn't even articulate.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you say that too, because I was watching a podcast the other week and well, I should say I was viewing one of the reels, which hopefully our listeners have seen on social media, our reels that we've been putting out. But it was interesting. It was this conversation around, what are the best things about America, right? And one of the things that makes America so great is the multiculturalism, right? Because I heard another one of our past presidents that said, you can't go to Japan and become Japanese. You can't go to Italy and become an Italian. But you can come to America and become an American, whatever culture you're from. And so, like looking at it through that lens, it's like there's so much cultural well-being just right here. Um, and that's the beautiful thing, like living in a large city like Los Angeles, and I'm sure Sydney as well, that there's just culture everywhere.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
melting pot of diversity and it's beautiful, right? So I hear that. And um, and I love it. Like you can
mhm.
walk out your front door and you can eat anything you want and you can experience anything you want. And there's so many wonderful things that we can actually appreciate.
Yeah.
about this multicultural kind of landscape. And you're right, Sydney is very much the same, Jason. And like, if you walk out my street and look at all the neighbors, like there's everything and it's all good and it's wonderful. And I know that there's sometimes it's not, and that's part of what we're trying to bring voice to today around how we can embrace
Mhm.
one of the most powerful tools that we keep talking about is this idea of curiosity, right? Like it's one of the ways to build this idea of cultural well-being instead of kind of going, oh no, they're different, actually leaning in with interest rather than assumption. So we
Yeah.
can create this space for understanding and so we can actually learn from each other. Because I can guarantee you through my travels around the world, I have picked up on so many things that we don't do here in Australia that have really kind of just been phenomenally wonderful that I wish we did here.
Yeah.
And, without the curiosity and the open mindedness, it'd be like, holy dooly, like I would have missed out on something so wonderful if I didn't have that curiosity and that space for understanding
Yeah.
and that space for appreciation of difference as opposed to um, not actually leaning into it.
Yeah. I often, when and I think this is a good question for our listeners too, is when you hear the word curiosity, what comes to mind for you, right? Like one of the things that I think of is, children, you know, how they're so curious through play, through discovery, their bias is so low, you know, when they're young. And you've probably, I mean, not having kids, but observing kids and having nieces and nephews, and you've probably seen this with your own kids, Leanne, is just how that curiosity is just so vibrant when
Mm,
kids are young. And they just go and just they cross that bridge, right? And it and as an adult, it connects us what we don't know and what we're willing to learn, right?
yeah,
What are we willing to learn through curiosity as an adult, where we have all these assumptions and et ceteras, et ceteras. And also that the neuroscience shows that curiosity actually quiets the amygdala, and which is the part of our brain that triggers fear and defensiveness, right?
yeah,
So, um, so when you're in that fearful state or you're in that defensiveness state, it's because your amygdala is triggered, and your curiosity is floating in the background. It's not on the front burner of the stove. I don't know if
absolutely.
there's anything else you would like to add to that.
Yeah, the amygdala is like a alarm system to the brain, right? Like it's the emotional house of the brain. It's
Yep.
probably the best way to put it, and it creates that threat state. And when we're in a threat state, curiosity is out the window, collaboration's out the window, connection is out the window, right? And if we can kind of turn the dial down on the amygdala with curiosity and actually go, well, hang on a second, what don't I know here? What might be worth looking at? We can turn the dial down on that threat state and actually start leaning into it. But you made a point about kids before, Jason, and one of the greatest gifts of having children I found was looking at the world through their eyes, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to making them look through mine. Because kids are just open, right? They're sponges. They just want to explore everything. They want to know everything, right? Like there's this whole world out there. And adults, we're so rigid and so serious, and we've got so many rules and regulations in our mind and so many assumptions, whereas kids don't have any of that. And one of the things that I was conscious about as a parent was not projecting my stuff onto my kids,
Yeah.
like, and actually looking at the world through their eyes and finding the joy in the simplest things, right? And I think if we can go back to that childlike wonder,
Mm-hmm.
that childlike playful state where it's like, oh, there's something new here. What can I learn? How can we play? If we can do that, then we have much more joy.
Yeah.
And they've got this. They've actually coined it play joy. That children learn through play, but
Mm-hmm.
adults can too. And when we play, it brings joy. So, what sort of play can you bring in to turn down this kind of fear state and the defensiveness and actually have a bit more curiosity, and learn something new, whatever that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing when you were talking about like the alarm system, right, of the brain, um, is that it also made me think from like a mindset point of view that like when we're triggered and we're in that state of fear and defensiveness, because I've seen it within my own self, is it's like there's an automatic switch from growth mindset to fixed,
Absolutely.
because the
Yeah.
fixed is safety, right? But it's my self-awareness that's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm being too transactional over here. Now, like I need to, it's almost like force yourself, especially when you're in trigger land, to be like, okay, wait a minute, go back to my growth mindset. Like, what am I learning here? Right? What am I supposed to take away from this experience? Um, and many times it's not all bad, right? Because that's where we grow. But you got to learn to have that self-awareness of when you're operating too much in fixed and transactional mindset, however you want to think about it, right? To be like, okay, what is it going to take for me to move back over to the growth mindset, to be in that more curious? And I think you brought um, a great thing up with kids, right? Where it's like they're more in a growth mindset, or at least from my own observations, most of the time, because they're just growing and learning and asking questions, and there's like no fear. It's like, okay, you know what? Hey, if I go do this and I make a mistake, fall down, I just get up and brush myself off and go on to the next thing. So,
Yeah, and this whole idea of, I love that you brought fixed and growth mindset in, because under it, when we are threatened, we are in a fixed mindset because of that safety.
mhm,
And the only antidote really to that is curiosity, like turning the curious dial on, and yet that's one of the hardest things to do in that state. And so that self-awareness piece and using those triggers as opposed to shutting down and going into that fixed state, it would be great if we could go, "Oh, this feels uncomfortable, and then how can I become more curious?" rather than our natural responses to self-protect. Because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, right? It's to protect ourselves. But when we're in that kind of state, then we're cutting off everything else around us. So, and with the curiosity, we can start asking a better question. So rather than asking, well, why did they do that to me or what's going on? We can ask, I wonder what's behind that.
mhm.
I wonder what's triggering that. And again, bringing in that wonder, that childlike wonder, it allows us to look at things from a different perspective as opposed to, I've got to protect myself here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great question, which I think ties beautifully to, well, what did I learn from that? And, et cetera. And so, it's that reframe, right? But sometimes in the moment, we're so caught up in whatever it is, right? That we forget to do the reframe question. um, and with that, that small shift that you were just talking about with that reframing the question helps to build empathy, because when we are curious, we're not trying to be right, we're trying to understand. And I think that goes back to, in one of our episodes, I think it might have been with Ali, for mental intellectual well-being, is that listening to understand versus listening to be right or to react.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we all listened to understand, right?
Oh
Rather
my
than listening
gosh.
to respond or react, to actually stop and listen to and through what somebody is saying, as
Yeah.
opposed to they say a couple of words and we get into our head thinking about our response and we've missed the rest of that conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think it's great, to ask these questions and to do these reframes and that understanding to our topic today of cultural well-being. Because how often do we make assumptions, right? because of our bias,
Yeah.
versus just that little, and we can totally see it in such a new light that has been operating here in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think the more that we can practice self-awareness, the more that we can practice, um, I often say if you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes, like how would I feel if I was how would I feel if that happened to me? How would I feel if that was said to me? Like I often ask my kids, like I've got teenagers and teenagers are notoriously selfish and self-centered, right? And I've got 3 of them living in the house. And so sometimes it's the question around, well, how would you feel if that was done to you? How would you feel if that was said to you? Like, so asking a different sort of question can lead to so much more insight. Like when we try to understand, well, what's behind that? Where might they be today? What might they be going through today? Like it's a really different space. And again, going back to that unwavering positive regard, right? Like I want people to have compassion for me. I want people to have understanding for me. And I want that for other people as well. And
Yeah.
so it's a really interesting thing that you bring in there. And I think it's so worth us spending the time just to ponder that. How can I be more curious? And how can I be more understanding? And how can I actually flip the script a little bit on some of the questions that I'm asked,
Yeah.
right? Like just
Yeah.
flipping the script that little bit, which then, as you said, builds that empathy, right? And at the end of the day, we all want empathy, and you know, empathy is an active state. It's not just something that we think; it's something that we do. Like empathy is
Hmm.
something that we share. It's a shared humanity. Um, and we talked about bias at the beginning, and I just want to bring this in again here now because you mentioned it also, Jason, that, you know, similarity bias comes into play. Like our brains are wired to prefer people who look like us, who sound like us, who think like us, who went to the same school as us, who might have had the same jobs as us. Like we like people that are like us. It's a survival instinct, but it actually limits our perspective. And there's more than 150 biases in the brain that have been noted already. And I'm sure there's probably more that science hasn't kind of encountered yet. But similarity bias is one of the ones that really can get in the way of our connection to people
Hmm.
because people that are like us, sure, feel safe, like we talked about not needing to self protect, but it's actually limiting in so many ways. It limits our perspective. We can't see multiple things. We don't have multiple views. So we're actually having a very narrowed view. And there's this whole world out here that we might not even consider because it hasn't been our experience. And that's our bias. But that doesn't mean it's right or wrong, like if, at the end of the day. So we need this kind of more open perspective. And the interesting thing about bias is that we can see it really easily in other people, but we can't see it in ourselves because it is below our conscious awareness.
Hmm.
Um, and so we can kind of look at others and go, oh, you're so biased, or you're this, or you're that. But actually, we all are. We just don't see it in ourselves because it's part of our unconscious programming. And we can't take it out of people. So we
Yeah.
have to be more conscious about taking it out of our systems, our processes, and our communities and doing things in a way that we can actually navigate it as opposed to eliminate it because like I said, it is a mental shortcut in the brain. It actually is useful. Bias can be useful. Making quick decisions, expedience bias, where I can make a quick decision without having to overthink everything is actually
Hmm.
useful.
Hmm.
But it can also get in the way if I'm making decisions without thinking things through and aren't actually looking at all the options and all the information. So everything in moderation can be useful. It's when it's running rampant and outside of our awareness that it becomes an issue. And it can create a huge amount of problems. So I just again wanted to mention that about bias because there are so many of them to navigate. But there are a few that show up all the time, and similarity is one.
Hmm.
And you see it. Like I don't know about in America, but in Australia, um, your school time matters. So if you went to a particular school or some particular schools, when you go for job interviews as adults, even in your 50s, you will wear your school tie because if the employer sees your tie and went to that school, they will employ you. Like, and this is, and like, are they actually qualified for the job? Do they actually have the skills and expertise? Like, there's all these other questions. Oh, but because of the tie, you're in. Like, it's ridiculousness. So we need to kind of shake things up a little bit and be much more open to looking at each individual for their merit as opposed to the similarity thing that can kick in for us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you brought so much up there, and and I think, you know, our listeners can take that can take what you just said and dissect that on just their individual personal level, but also to leaders can take that in organizations, and you could probably do a whole week retreat on it, right? Um, you know, because having worked for many large organizations, mostly in healthcare, I saw it all the time, um, and with that similarity bias, comes like hanging out with people who create that comfort, create that calmness, and just that automatic trust because they look like you, or they speak like you, or they went to the same college as you, or whatever. So, there's just so much similarity bias that is at play, and people just aren't aware of it, you know. And so I think that organizations could just do so much on a local level and national and global level if they really leaned into this and like really dissected it and helped people, you know, get those ahas from it. So you unpacked a lot there.
I did. And one of the things that really just, as you were saying that, that just popped into my brain is that the most ridiculous egoic thing that we have as humans is that we believe that we're smart and that people like us are smart and everybody else is not. And or, we're better or whatever it might be. And it's so ridiculous because it's this egocentric kind of phenomenon, right? But it's like, hang on a second. How can you actually say that? Like there's this whole information out there that's so ridiculous. It makes me laugh because I see it. I even see it you see it in children, to a certain degree. You see it all over the place. And I think similarity biases can be one of the most destructive biases because it creates that division, right? People like me versus people that are not like me. And at the end of the day, if we have to be mindful of when this is kicking in. We have to be mindful of when our subconscious is rejecting things. Because if I think that you're like me, I will listen to your ideas with the same neural pathways that I listen to my own ideas.
Yeah.
But if I think that you're different to me, my brain actively, subconsciously rejects what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it's not a conscious thing. We're not trying to do this. It's part of our biology. So we
Yeah.
have to work harder to actually stop that from happening. We have to work harder to be more open to the differences and the diversity
Yeah.
because um, otherwise we're missing out on so much.
Yeah.
And again, I want to say a lot of it isn't conscious. It's a subconscious phenomenon.
Yeah.
But we need to make the subconscious conscious so we can actually change.
Yeah. Well, and what you brought up for me there, because I've seen it in so many organizations that I've worked with where a lot of times leaders actually create similarity bias intentionally and strategically because they're like, well, depending on who the group of people is that's being spoken to, right, in the boardroom or conference room or whatever. Because I've been in those meetings where it's like, okay, why don't you, meaning person A, why don't you actually be the facilitator, deliver the information? Because, and a lot of times it comes down to race, right? Where it's like, because most of the individuals in this room are blank race, so it will land differently than if I would say it. And I've been in those conversations and I've been in that strategy where, and it's like, it's so like there's an awareness around it, right? But then there's also this subconscious that's working in the background that you don't realize is. So it's interesting on how organizations can actually be intentional about creating similarity bias.
Yeah, and absolutely. Um, which is interesting, right? So using it to your favor as opposed to using it against,
Right.
um, and finding the balance between that because I something about that feels a bit icky to me also. I have
Right.
to
Right.
say,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
Like it feels a bit icky. It's like is that a source of manipulation almost, right? So you've got to kind of tread lightly around that. One of the things that I actually bring into organizations, Jason, um, to try and build more of this diverse thinking and more of this open mindedness is that I say to leaders, in your meetings, every meeting, somebody should be allocated as the chief contrarian. So, and not the same person every meeting because you don't want that person being hated because they're always the one dissenting. But actually, every session, have somebody new be the dissenter. So it doesn't matter what we're bringing in, fight against it. You know, don't accept, deny, like challenge us in everything that we're trying to have a conversation around today so we can make sure that we're looking at things more broadly because we don't want groupthink where everyone just kind of says yes because it's safer. And we don't want only similarity bias kicking in. So again, we're all going to think similarly and then we're missing out on a whole range of stuff. So the more diverse perspectives that we can bring in, and the more that we actively challenge and have somebody every session be the challenger. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not the same voice challenging, but every decision that's being made, let's challenge it. Let's look at it from different perspectives. They're finding that they're making much less mistakes, that they've got more cohesive teams because they are actually allowing dissent rather than everyone just thinking that they have to agree because let's face it, differences of opinions are actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have blind spots and I don't even know where my spots start and end, as we all do. But if we've got people around us that have the courage to go, actually, no, let's have a look at this from a different perspective, it makes organizations smarter. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to bring that in because I think it's so useful if you are a leader to actually think about how can I make sure that we're leaving no stone unturned? How can I make sure that we're looking at this from multiple perspectives? And not multiple similar perspectives, but really diverse perspectives. How can we make sure that we're bringing some of that into our decision making, our hiring, our policy and procedure, all of it?
Yep. Absolutely. So the goal at the end of the day is not to eliminate bias, um, but it's to become aware of it. I'm going to say that again. The goal is not to eliminate bias, but it's to become aware of it. And once folks reframe that, like so much amazingness can happen. So once we see it, we can then choose differently in a healthy way.
And it comes back down to this whole idea of curiosity and empathy, right? Because curiosity opens the door. I can look in and empathy walks through it. And
Yep.
I think if we can think about it from like that perspective, let's be curious, let's open the door and then let's lean in and walk through with that kind of open heart. So open mind, open heart. But we need an open will to do both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, um, now, which I think this conversation leads beautifully into the four dimensions of cultural well-being. And I'll go through the first one, which is cultural intelligence in drive. You can think of it as motivation, right? And then and when you think about it, it's around the interest and the confidence and the curiosity to engage with cultural differences, right? There's that motivation, that curiosity of like, hey, like let me lean into this and see what I'll learn, like I don't have all the answers, and as none of us should have all of them, right? And then the key question to leave yourself with is, am I genuinely motivated to understand others who see the world differently than I do? I think there's that motivation piece, but you can do it performatively versus authentically. And
Mm.
when you choose authenticity, you're going to get a very different experience than if you do it as a performative task that I like, oh, like my boss or whatever told me that I have to do this, versus genuinely having that curiosity of like, yeah, let me see how these other individuals see the world. And so the practice around that is to approach difference with curiosity, not avoidance. Find the why that fuels your individual engagement. And I think there's that motivation piece, the genuine piece, the curiosity, but then also the why. Why am I doing this? Right. And are you doing it performatively or are you doing it authentically?
And what's the why that we can all collectively come together on also, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when we have a shared goal, it builds bridges.
Yep.
You know, if we're all working on a shared goal, if we've got that why that means something to all of us, it's a bridge builder, and empathy is the well, curiosity builds the bridge and empathy walks across it. So thank you, Jason. The second one here is knowledge. It's the CQ, right? The cultural knowledge. And we can look at this as in or with understanding. So your awareness of cultural norms, values, systems, the whole lot. Now we've got since COVID, let's face it, the world has become smaller. Everyone's connecting online. Like we're doing this cross the oceans, right? In
Mm-hmm.
two different countries. And understanding the cultural norms, the values, the systems, and how we can operate well across the borders is so important. So it includes understanding how culture influences communication, leadership, and relationships. Like in Australia, we're APAC, Australia Pacific. So we've got all of these different cultures, and we're very close to Asia, and a lot of our organizations are cross pollinating there as well. And Japan have a very different cultural observations in the things that they do to what China might, to what Australia might. So understanding how culture influences our communication, our leadership, and our relationships makes a difference. So
Mm-hmm.
learn before you lead. If you're a leader, learn first. Like learn about these cultural differences. Ask, observe, listen, seek out local context before applying these global assumptions that
Mm-hmm.
my way is the best way. The more that we can lean into again this curiosity space, and the more that we can actually acknowledge I don't know it all, and that's okay. I'm open to learning. Again, that growth mindset of being open to learning, seeking information, leaning into the discomfort of not knowing, and actually being open to learning something new, turns down the dial on these assumptions. And assumptions, I mean, we say here in Australia, to assume makes an ass out of you and me because of the way assume is spelt. I don't know if you say that in America, but it's
We do.
ass, you, me, right? So the more that we're making assumptions, the more we're making asses of ourselves, and we've got to stop doing that. So that's the next phase.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We do say that in America too. Um, and it's a good reminder, you know, when I make my own assumptions, I'm like,
Mm,
okay,
yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, so there's there's that mindfulness and that awareness there, right? The third tentacle of cultural intelligence is cultural strategy and the intelligence around that. And you can also think of it as mindfulness. So this tentacle is the ability to reflect, pause, take a step back, and plan before acting in culturally diverse situations. And I think that goes back to that strategy of like, learn before do the environmental scan. Like take a moment to do it. Do some research, um, so that you don't make that ass out of you and me in a meeting or in a at a networking event or whatever, right? Take the time to do that cultural um to pause, reflect, and to do that cultural environmental scan. And also, just for your own practice, notice your automatic reactions, your triggers, right? Then reframe them and ask, what might this mean from their perspective? right? Get out of your own way, get out of your own perspective and ask the what, the what from their perspective, right? And a little bit of neuroscience here is that this practice of mindfulness taps into the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to override your instinctive bias with conscious awareness. So it's moving back into that curiosity state, right? So you're seeing how curiosity is weaving through all these different elements of cultural well-being and the different tentacles that Leanne and I are talking about around cultural intelligence. I'll
Yeah.
turn it over to you to take the last one.
Yeah, I love that you brought the neuroscience back in there, Jason, because when we engage our prefrontal cortex, thinking part of our brain, it turns the dial down on that emotional house, the amygdala, and all of those unconscious things that kind of go along, right, under our conscious awareness. So, um, and I said earlier, it's about bringing the unconscious into conscious awareness so we can actually do something different, right? So I love that you brought that back in. And the last one is about action and adaptability here. It's this whole idea of um, being mindful about our approach and the way we um, can be flexible and adjust. Like flexibility is such a valuable leadership skill. And I think sometimes we don't think about the importance of our ability to be flexible, to be able to adjust, to pivot, to move, to change, and not just our communication, but our responses, our approaches, all of it. You know, if we can take a pulse check on the cultural cues within our organizations or our communities or our neighborhoods, we can then adapt, we can flex, we can adjust to actually meet that. So we can adapt and flex without losing authenticity, though. We can still be really authentic, but we can shift how we express our
Mm-hmm.
respect, or we can shift how we build trust while staying true to your values. And values is a really interesting thing to bring in here because our values drive us. And most of us have values of connection, of love, of respect, of honor, of integrity. You know, there's these big words that kind of come up for us around values. And I'd love it if all of you, if you haven't already, go and do a deep dive into what are my top 5 values and how are
Mm-hmm.
they being expressed? And are there ways that I can express them more authentically, but in a way that's also got adaptability and flexibility so we can create this environment or this culture of connection as opposed to division. So that ability to be able to know who you are and then also flex yourself and adapt to where you are at any particular time. Being mindful. I love that you brought mindfulness in on the last one because I think this is an underrated um, concept. You know, the more
Mm-hmm.
mindful we can be, the more aware we can be, the more curious we can then be, and the more empathy we can then bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there's just so much that's like built into each of these four areas, and why cultural intelligence matters, both for well-being and for leadership, right? um because it enhances our empathy, being able to see others through their lens actually increases your own emotional intelligence. And so the enhanced empathy, along with it, helps to build belonging. It helps people thrive when they feel respected and understood and heard. I would actually put in there too. Um, and I'll let you talk about the next couple in this area of why cultural intelligence matters for well-being and leadership.
Yeah, I think having people feel seen, heard, valued, respected, understood, right? Like exactly what we want. Like we all want this, right? And it builds belonging. So I think that's interesting. And if we look at that, because we do all want it, it reduces conflict. Because awareness prevents misunderstandings and unconscious exclusions. I ran a program, and they talked about, if we're not intentionally including, we're unintentionally and unconsciously excluding. So
Mm.
again, it's about intentional, be intentional about reducing conflict, be intentional about reducing misunderstandings and reducing that whole idea of exclusion, because we want to reduce conflict at the end of the day. I mean, we're all human, we're all living in this earth, we're global citizens at the end of the day, right? Like that's what it comes down to. And it also then strengthens collaboration, because the
Mhm.
more that there's less conflict, the more that I'm open, the more diverse the teams are, the more creative they are, the more resilient they are, the more intelligent they are at the end of the day. So we want to strengthen our ability to collaborate. Um, and find ways to do that. And the greatest way to do that is to find something to connect to in the other. Because at the end of the day, there's got to be something, there's something that
Yeah.
we do the same. And again, when we go back to similarity bias, if we can use similarity bias effectively to find things to connect to that makes us similar, then that
Mhm.
reduces the conflict and it strengthens that collaboration. So doing it with intent for connection rather than manipulation is the key though, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah.
Um, because diverse global citizens, as we are, fuels um, our contribution. It fuels our ability to be able to connect across borders. It fuels our ability to be able to reduce bias. Um, and it fuels our ability to be able to connect in ways that we can't currently. So we would really want to drive global citizenship. I mean, Jason and I alluded to that right at the very beginning. Like it doesn't matter where my butt is sat. Like I'm a citizen of the globe and I want to be open to the experiences of everything. And if we can
Absolutely.
all have that kind of mentality, it breeds more connection for sure.
Yeah. 100%. Which I think that leads nicely into the question of, like, and maybe some of our listeners are asking this question is like, well, what do I need to do to help grow my cultural intelligence, right? Um, and we have some tips for you. The first one is, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit in what you were talking to about, connecting to something, right? And that's really exposing yourself to difference, right? Like get out of your usual circle of people, your comfort zone. The only space you really grow is outside your comfort zone. So expose yourself to difference, whether that's traveling, um, reading, um, going to museums, listening to voices outside of who you normally might hang out with. Um, and also, I think there's a lot of cultural intelligence building when expose yourself to the arts, you know, whether that's going to a museum, like I just mentioned, or going to a play or a concert, et cetera. There's so much, where they say that, music is the universal language. It is. And I think arts as a whole is the universal language. So those are some tips to where you can, or one area of tips that you can help to grow your cultural intelligence.
Yeah. You said something there and it just triggered a thought in my head of a saying, there's no comfort in the growth zone and there's no growth in the comfort zone. And I think sometimes we've got to feel a bit uncomfortable by getting outside of our comfort zone so we can grow and evolve,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
evolving is what we're meant to do as spiritual beings. We spoke about this a couple of episodes ago, this concept of evolving. So, yeah, get out of your comfort zone. And I love anything that's new. So, music, museums, I'm saying yes to all of that, Jason.
Yes, me too.
Another thing. Another thing that you can do is reflect on bias. Like notice when you're othering in your language or your assumptions, right? And bring in more we and us versus them and othering. Like just even be mindful about the language you're using. How can we do this? like us kind of conversations to reduce the conflict or reduce the bias that could be in the mix. So being really open to noticing the bias and calling it out, right? If you notice it in a respectful way, because as I said earlier, if you have a brain, you're biased, you have bias, it just is. So normalizing our ability to be able to question those assumptions and those biases is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, on that reflection of bias, right, and doing something different or exposing yourself to something different is within that is to ask better questions. You know, get out of this space of judgment and replace it with curiosity. There comes curiosity again, right? And a helpful question, if you're like, well, God, I don't know what kind of better questions I can ask, start with the question of, can you tell me more about how this is done in your culture? Because you may have a way of doing something in your culture, right? um or in your country that you live in, etc., but it could be done completely different. You might get the same outcome, but just the approach might be different. So if you're struggling with what questions to come up with, because sometimes we can get in that overthinking mode, right, is just ask, can you tell me how this is done in your culture? Simple question. And it opens the space for like, yeah, actually, yeah, I'd love to tell you more about that.
And it might actually be better, you like, right? Because, it might actually give us something that we didn't have before, which is fantastic. Um, and when we're asking these questions, it helps us to build these micro connections. So these small moments of respect, these small moments of curiosity, these small moments of connection creates that trust, right? And it reduces the division between people. So building in more ways to do micro connections. So whether it is, talking to somebody you wouldn't normally, asking questions of those that you wouldn't normally, smile. I mean, we talked about smiling a couple of sessions ago, but just even bringing that gift of a smile benefits everybody around. Um, and it may not be reciprocated, and that's okay, right? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's about who am I and how am I showing up, and being mindful about who I am in this very moment, and being conscious about building connections, even if tiny micro connections of that respect and curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing that also comes into that, right, when you practice those micro connections and all the above, you almost automatically are operating more in an area of gratitude than not. And it's just amazing on how that just kind of naturally occurs when when you just tweak stuff just like a little bit. It doesn't have to be a 360 or 180-degree change. I mean, it can be a 5% change. And so there's no rule to it, I guess, is what I'm saying. And because especially for those rule followers, right, it's like, well, do I change 5%? Do I change 10%? Change what feels good to you. Change what, tweak it. It may be 5% for the next 2 weeks, and then maybe you might graduate to 10%. So I would just say don't overthink it, the process. And also this last area is, practice all this with humility. You know, lead, it, you know, lead can mean in your organization or leading in your life or in your family or, in whatever entity that you're showing up in. Lead as a learner and not as an expert. You don't have to know everything, and that's okay. Sometimes it gives your brain that, okay, like I have a moment to like relax. Like I don't have to be on like I'm an expert on everything and faking my way through it when you're really not an expert in whatever area. And sometimes you are the expert, and that's great too. So it's that practicing of humility, and that the core idea about all this is that cultural intelligence is not about knowing everything about every culture. Like you just can't, right? That's where that curiosity comes in, um, and that kindness and that being adaptable to learn from any culture. Like there's that other piece of curiosity, but then also marrying it with adaptability. And um, you know, and when all that just naturally happens, you're automatically showing up as a more mindful, self-aware human being. Um, and you're going to get so much more interesting experiences and interesting questions back to you as far, and then also you're opening yourself up to ask those interesting and open-ended questions to learn as well. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that, Leanne.
The only thing that popped into my mind there, Jason, was a saying that I heard again. I'm regurgitating sayings today, but it's a beginner's mind has multiple possibilities, an expert mind has, right? So the more that we've got this kind of beginners, open, learning, curious, adaptable mindset, anything is possible. Anything is possible. But the more we think we know and it's this way and this is the way it's always been and this is the way we've always got to do it, there is no growth in that, no movement, so no possibilities for anything new. So be a learner, be a beginner, have that beginner's mindset, that learner's mindset that allows you to expand and to lean in, and to adapt, as Jason said. I think that's really, really key because we
Yes.
want to make sure that we're building in, and it doesn't matter. I mean, when we're talking about cultural well-being, we've alluded or kind of skirted around the sides of a whole lot of big topics that we could spend lots of time in, and we've intentionally not gone too deep on anything that could create stuff. But whether it's cultural by way of ethnicity, whether it's cultural by way of religion, whether it's cultural by way of sexuality, whether it's cultural by way of where you're from in the world, like all of this, right? Be open to learning and around all of this, because where fear comes from is when we don't know something, right? And when we're in fear, we're closed off to anything possible. But the more that we can kind of be curious, the more that we can eliminate the fear from what we don't know or don't understand and actually build some understanding and empathy, which is that bridge, the more that we're going to have this cultural intelligence that serves humanity as a whole. And that's really what's most important, because there's all sorts of topics that this relates to, even though we're kind of skirting around the outsides without diving too deeply into any particular one too much.
Yeah.
Because I know that we've, like I said earlier, we've got all sorts of things in our world, and having that open heart, open mind, and open will to lean in is really the key.
Yeah. Yeah. We got a little bit of you talking in kind of motion. Your screen was kind of freezing here, so we got this, then we got this. We could hear you perfectly, which that was the most important. Yeah, no, I think you're spot on there, Leanne, and I think that this beautifully actually moves into our next conversation on cultural humility, right? And which is often confused out there with cultural competence, but they are not the same. And Leanne, would you like to talk a little bit about cultural competence and the difference
Sure.
between the two?
Yeah, so cultural competence is about knowing. It's about having information about others. Like I have this understanding, or this knowledge base. Whereas cultural humility is more about learning. It's being open and adaptable and willing to say, "Hey, I don't know, but I'm willing to listen. Like I'm willing to ask questions. I'm willing to learn here." So cultural competence. So if you think about competence is how much I know, like it's quite fixed. Whereas cultural humility is more open. It's more growth mindseted. It's about leaning into the discomfort and going, I don't know, but I want to know more. Like help me to understand more.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think you made that distinction really well because that kind of can get confusing, right? Um, where where that competence is more kind of, I know, boxed, I guess, right? That you can fill out on the form at work, like I am culturally competent in A, B, and C. Where where that humility is that never-ending learning. Um, so that was super powerful, and hopefully that shed some light for our listeners of the distinction between the two, because oftentimes it can get confusing, and it's like, well, like, what's the differences? What are the what are the commonalities? Uh, because humility requires us to take a step back from certainty and lean into curiosity. I know curiosity is coming up like all the time, but it's such a connector in just everything that we're talking about today. Um, so remember that humility requires us to take that pause and take that step back from certainty, which is kind of the safe zone, right? It's like less fearful, less unknown, to lean into that curiosity to really learn more, and it's that outside your comfort zone to grow. So remember that tip there.
Yeah, again, going back to that beginner's mindset of curiosity, right? And multiple possibilities is what I'm hearing you say there, Jason. And the more that we can, if we're in certainty, then there's no flexibility in that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no flexibility. It's very rigid. So we want to be more adaptable, more flexible. And the other part of this is also to recognize our privilege, right? And to recognize it without guilt and without shame. Um, because we all, as Jason said right at the beginning, we all have different privilege. And what we want to do is find become more aware about what our privilege is and
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge it, right? Because we do have it. There's no point saying, oh, no, I don't. We do. There's privilege everywhere. But the question is, how can we use our privilege to influence
Mm-hmm.
and to lift others, to amplify voices and create space for equity and equality, um, as opposed to using it to shut down or to be shameful about the fact that we have it. We have it. And we've all got different privilege. But the question is, how can I use my privilege as a platform to
Mm-hmm.
amplify others and to lift them and to create this space for equality? And if we look at it from that perspective and actually use it with intention for that uplift and that amplification of humanity as a whole, um, then we can start having some different conversations. If we use it to shut things down or divide or create division or segregation, it's not okay. But if we use it to create connection and to uplift, um, and to give voice to topics that aren't being navigated well, then we're creating a completely different culture for all of us.
Yeah, yeah. And what made me so loved all that, and it like started pinging like insights here and there. And one thing that came to mind is when we were talking about similarity bias, right? And how a lot of organizations actually strategically use similarity bias in like different situations and all that, is a lot of times they'll use, in a given situation, similarity bias to amplify someone's privilege, right? Depending on who's being spoken to, who's in the room, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of see that as like positional use of privilege, right? Within, along with being married to similarity bias, like the two operating together. But it's like, if you, which I get, right? But then also too, if you use it in the bigger context, how powerful that can be. But it really takes curiosity and courage to step over that next line, right? Or jump that next hurdle to actually do that. But there's a lot of power, and just, I see so much potential, um, or potentiality is one of my words that I love to use. So with that, also is using what we have, whether it's our education, our access, or opportunity, not to dominate, but to elevate. So I think that marries into what I was just saying, that if we use it in the right way, we're not using it to dominate, we're using it to elevate. But I think in some situations, right, where that similarity bias and that privilege are married together, not saying that it never elevates, but a lot of times it's used to dominate
Yeah.
the time and the situation.
And we can see that, right? We can see that in so many aspects at the moment across globe. And again, um, but if we stand united and if we call out and use our voices to amplify equity and equality for all, and have the courage to do so, and safety in numbers, because there's so many that want to create a space of harmony for all of us to live in, for our future generations. So it's about giving back in a way that actually enhances humanity. And
Mm-hmm.
this could be, how could, and if you think about it, how can I give back in a way that enhances humanity? Could it be that I mentor somebody from a different background, or gender, or um, sexuality, or whatever it might be, like actually leaning into and looking at how can I mentor somebody from something different? How can I support local cultural initiatives? How can I listen to stories that are different to my own? How can I choose to be different? As a leader, how can I choose to lean into learning about the differences? Um, you know, we want to create equity and equality for all. Like, again, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what you look like, who you love. At the end of the day, our blood all runs the same color. Like
Mm-hmm.
like it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, there's all of this stuff that appears different, but if you come down to it at the core, we've all got the same color blood.
Yep.
We're all the same. So using these things to close the gap, right? And to lean into um supporting a bigger population or a bigger community than you normally would.
Yeah. And this is key because it's also where your emotional intelligence really shows up, right? And thinking about noticing your reactions from the triggers that you're getting, right? And feeling that shift from um, growth mindset to transactional fixed mindset, but then using your emotional intelligence to bring yourself back over into the growth mindset space, right? And staying open when you feel uncomfortable, right? That's kind of that analogy of the mindset, is that, like, when you're in that transactional fixed mindset, you are more closed off because it's safe, right? You feel comfortable, but it's that moving back over to be in that discomfort, and then asking, what can I learn here, right?
Yeah.
And I think we all have instances in work, whether you're an entrepreneur like Leanne and I, or you work in a big, multinational corporation, or a local nonprofit, or a national nonprofit, or government. um, there's so many ways that you can bring in this EQ to be self-aware around your triggers, your reactions, staying in that uncomfortable zone, and then asking yourself, what can I learn here? If you do that, magic will happen. But it also takes that courage and curiosity that we were talking about too, and that motivation and desire to want to do it. too. There is that desire. I mean, there's some people who are like, I have no desire, like, and I've seen it so many times, especially in individuals who are getting ready to retire. They're like, I don't need to, no.
No.
And but you know all this stuff has no age limit. um and I think that's one thing that I think we're also trying to drive home here in this whole conversation, is that whether you're 10 years old, right, or you're 100 years old, all this is applicable. It's just not for those working years, um but it's for the entirety of your life and your interaction with humanity around the globe.
And you said something before, Jason, and I think it's so true. Like there is no barriers around age. We can all lean into doing things differently. Um, and the other thing that you said is about leaning into the discomfort, because if you think about your own life, I know for my life particularly, my greatest learnings have been through my most uncomfortable experience. Right? Not through the good. When the good's good, you don't learn much, right? You don't kind of learn much about yourself or about anything else. But the
Yeah.
discomfort is actually the teacher. And if we can actually lean into that, like discomfort is the teacher because it stretches us, right, to learn something new. It stretches us to that growth is really the whole purpose of life. Like we're
Mhm.
not one and done, we're continuously evolving, and it requires us to lean into discomfort to do that. And when we do that, it reminds us that we can have empathy, that we can have humility for ourselves and others. And that all of these things go hand in hand. So when we stretch and evolve, as much as it feels uncomfortable, we're actually doing a great service to humanity, right? And to ourselves because we're all elevating simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah. And that brings me to this quote that we found, not sure the author of the quote, but and it speaks so perfectly to what we're talking about here, is that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. Right? I'll read that again. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. There's power in that, and I think it is so married to everything that we've talked about up to this point. And I'll turn it over to you, Leanne, so that we can talk about like the building of bridges and not the putting up of walls, that that I think is so essential to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, because we really do want to bring this into our communities and our workspaces, right? Like at the end of the day, it's one thing to have a conversation, but how do I actually do it? Like, what are the steps that we can take? And we've kind of alluded to a few around being um, empathetic and around being adaptable and having that flexibility. So all of these things really are some of the keys that we can have, but it starts small, tiny micro moments, right? That we can bring in. And they talk about the 1 millimeter rule. If we shifted our steering wheel just 1 millimeter, it won't look different right here where we're driving, but 100 kilometers or 100 miles, I think you guys say in the States down the road,
Mhm.
it's going to be in completely different place from that 1 millimeter shift. So it's really about being inclusive in all ways, wherever we can, with these small, small acts. Jason, do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, and when I think of small acts, right, like I think of small acts of kindness, right, to put that kindness element to it. um and I've seen some organizations do it really well, right, and some that don't do it well. That could learn from some of these organizations that have been pretty successful in these small acts of kindness. And it can be as simple as being inclusive in meetings, right? As a leader, you have so much influence in the moment, and that to produce good, you just got to get out of your ego, you know. So it's that being inclusive in meetings. And when it comes to decision making, right, invite the diverse perspectives in. Like, I have heard over and over again many people say that their best team experiences have been multicultural teams, because the perspectives and in the decision making, um it's just so much, it's so much more broader, because there's not as many negative biases built in or baked into the decision when you have the diverse perspectives coming into making that final decision. And then it's, that lovely thing that I talked about a little bit earlier, is that listening to understand in the moment versus listening to be triggered and respond and to be that I am right, versus like, what is this conversation trying to tell me? Or what am I supposed to be getting out of this meeting for the bigger picture, not for the smaller picture to pet my ego, so that, you can stomp off to your next meeting, right? But where individuals will have so much higher respect and trust for you. It, it is amazing when you listen versus respond. I mean, yes, there's always a response that needs to come, but it doesn't need to come half a second after the person's done talking, right? So there's power in that particular entity and element, and the larger element of small acts of kindness.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we do this well, um, and we listen to people and we lean in and we pause and actually take in what they've said, process it, and then respond, it's a completely different style of listening. It's being, and you feel seen when somebody listens to you
Mm.
with that intensity, right? Like you absolutely know the difference when they've truly heard you, thought about what you've said, and responded, as opposed to having that response locked in before you've even finished speaking. It's a completely different level of listening. And the neuroscience of belonging tells us that when people feel seen, when they feel heard, their brain responds um, in a way that actually has them be more creative, be more calm, be more collaborative, be more resilient. So again, when we feel that, it creates this neurobiologically response that has us show up better. And interestingly, they've done studies over organizations, and what they've come to realize is that individuals who feel more seen, heard, respected, valued actually give 40% more discretionary effort into their workplace. So if you think about that as a leader, if you want people to show up and give more and be intentional about the work that they're doing, the more seen and heard they are, the more they will give you. And the less they feel like they belong, the less they'll actually make an effort, or the less that they'll give you in the workplace. So
Mhm.
the more that we can hold space for people in a way that actually has them shine, the more then they're going to give in their effort, in their time, and in their output. And like that's dollar signs as a leader,
Mm.
but also as a community. It has people showing up and shining their light and doing the work that they're called to do in a way that serves everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also, um it makes your reputation as a leader of, like, because you know how, people, I mean, people talk and it spreads like wildfire, right? Both in the organization and outside of the organization. And it's like, if you're a leader that shows up that way, and really see, hear, value, appreciate your staff members, people will say, I want to work for that person. I want to work for that organization. So there's like this amazing credibility, um, and reputation ripple effect that happens by a leader's local, when I say local actions, meaning local actions within their team, um, which also goes into of why inclusion, right, is not just a moral goal that an organization or a leader should have, but it's actually a performance advantage. Because a little bit ago, when we were talking about decision making, that diverse teams actually make better decisions because they see the world through more lenses. And I think that that marries into what I said, where then less biases are baked into the decision, right? So less has to be undone in the long run when you have these more diverse audiences helping to make the decisions.
And I love that culturally within organizations and on a global level, cultural well-being helps us solve shared challenges. Like we have global challenges. We think that it's just in our little state or just in our little country, but there's cultural challenges across the globe, whether it's climate, whether it's conflict, whether it's inequity. These things are a global phenomenon, and when we kind of work in this space, we work together across this kind of global phenomenon, we access collective intelligence or global intelligence, right? It's not just what we think, but what can we do as a human race to solve some of these big issues that we face around climate, conflict, inequity, and there's a whole range more, right? So not just organizationally, but globally, we can affect change in a big way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would recommend to our listeners, for those that to get more familiar with some of those global challenges is to go to the United Nations website and look up the 2030 agenda and look at the 17 sustainable development goals that are being worked on. They deal with humanity, they deal with climate, they deal with healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much there. Like it will just open your eyes to a whole new world of the global challenges that are being faced right now. And then the challenges within that of how cultures are different, are working through those global challenges, but then also governments, et cetera, et cetera. So great place to go and peruse that part of the website and see what's going on, and and really get a deeper level from an intelligence standpoint of of what's going on in the bigger level, but like what you can actually do, on your local level to help make change happen. Sorry to diverge down that little rabbit hole there.
That's great.
but I think it's a great resource for listeners, and you can get a whole bunch around cultural well-being just from that area alone, and marry it to our conversation that we're having today. Which goes into that this topic of cultural well-being, how it becomes in the bigger picture global well-being, and that we realize that our futures as individual human beings, our communities, our families, the larger populations where we live are all intertwined into this area of global well-being, and we all have to be involved at some level, and every little millimeter inch forward will make, I mean, if everyone like I saw on the news last night, they were over so many years they were working on getting this battleship that was used in World War II, I think, and it was housed in New Jersey. They were going to use it for scrap metal, but the local community, I forget which state it was in, they actually started this fund with kids to put a dime towards building the fund to get it back to the local community. And they did it over, I forget how many years it was, but they raised like I don't know, like almost $400,000 with kids donating a dime towards this. So that's where I'm like, if you donate a millimeter, an inch towards the betterment of global well-being, if everyone did that, we would be in such a better place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you said there, that we realize that our futures are intertwined, right? Like as a global community. And I think that's so important. And if we do those small things, Jason, it helps us to build those bridges, not walls. It
Yeah.
helps us to have connection, not comparison. It helps us to look at what matters, right? From a global perspective, it's where we're looking from that matters, not what we're kind of looking at. Because where we're looking from as a global citizen, we all matter, right? So we need to shift our conditioning, our perspective. We need to be more open minded about this and realize that we are connected. It is the tapestry of humanity. We
Mhm.
started with that. And I think if we think about that, this whole idea is that we're all beautifully connected to each other, interwoven even as this global community, and how we can navigate the space to make life better for all of us is really what we need to be considering here.
Yeah. Yeah. And so with that, for our listeners, another question for you is, what bridge or bridges can you build today? Right? It doesn't have to be the San Francisco Bay Bridge. I don't know what the big bridge in
The Harbour Bridges in Sydney.
the Harbor Bridge in Sydney, which I have been there.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Back in 2000. But yeah, it's like, what are these small little bridges that you can build, right? To starting today. And, it could be sharing a meal, starting a conversation, and learning about someone's story, that's different from you. Um, and that all goes down to that theme throughout today's conversation on cultural well-being, embracing the tapestry of humanity, is curiosity, right?
Kindness,
Mm-hmm.
curiosity and kindness,
And
right?
kindness.
And
Yes.
kindness, these small acts of kindness,
Yeah.
whatever that looks like. And however minuscule can have, it's like the ripple effect. They say that a butterfly flapping its wings on one end of the earth can create a tsunami on the other because
Yeah.
of the momentum it builds. So these little acts of kindness around cultural well-being um, is so important for all of us. And like Jason said, feel free to go and have a look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for the 2030. It's things like education and reduced inequities and peace and strong institutions and all of this stuff that we can learn more about so that we can show up differently, because who we are here and how we said this right actually before we got on today, how we do some things is how we do everything, right? So those little minuscule things can have the biggest impact, and how we do the little things will then lead to how we do the big things.
Yeah. And when you said that, Leanne, um, it 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 turned on the light bulb. Is how you do something is how you do everything, right? So if you show up with a fixed mindset or transactional mindset all the time, that's how you do. That's your pattern. That's your behavior. Not saying that you can't change those, because you can, but it takes that self-awareness, right? And that leaning into that discomfort zone where growth really, really happens, and instead of just feeling that comfortableness and getting those shots of dopamine, but where you're really learning and growing is in that uncomfortable zone. Um, and, I think that's a great question for people to ask themselves is, how do I do something, how do I do things? And then taking a step back to see how that shows up in all these areas in your life, right? Like, if you're 5 minutes late, are you 5 minutes late to every meeting? Are you 5 minutes late to blank blank blank, so I think those are behavioral patterns, that that we all need to look at, myself included. And because Leanne and I are not perfect, right? But we still have to lift up that rug sometimes and say, um, is it me? Is it really me? Right? Um,
Oh my God, it's me.
totally. Um, so and bring this back down to cultural well-being is when we invest in this area of cultural well-being, we are investing in global unity, which unity we talked at the very, 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 very beginning of today's conversation, because in a sense, we are then shaping the emotional and cultural DNA of future generations. Because we're all not going to be here for the rest of our lives, right? And we want to make sure that we're nurturing the future to be these thinkers around not just cultural well-being, but global well-being and all these areas of well-being that we've talked about before. So it's never too late to start shaping um, the future generations in these areas.
Absolutely. And um, it's about being this global citizen,
Mm-hmm.
like not just thinking about my family, my postcode, my country, but recognizing our shared humanity and our shared responsibility as global citizens, where we can just do things for the benefit of everybody, not just
Yeah.
me, but we, not just I, but us, right? And really like shifting some of that language.
Yeah.
Because if we think global and act local, then every act of empathy contributes to collective change for
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that is we need to remind ourselves to think global, having that global mindset, but act local. So every small act of empathy and kindness contributes at such a more meaningful level than a lot of us realize to that collective change.
Absolutely. And it starts with awareness. We talk about this idea of self awareness all the time, but it's the first step. If we can become more aware of who we are, how we show up, our impact, our choices, the way we do things, we can start to enhance humanity one little minuscule step at a time, right? If we all just did that little bit of difference, then the ripple effect of that is, global. So
Yeah.
self-awareness is the key. Look within, notice your trigger points, notice where, you might be closed off, where there might be self-protecting, where you might have fear, where you might be shut down and actually start to shift some of that, become more courageous, become more curious, and become more connected. Um, because it's those skills that really will, impact our future generations. And I don't know about you, but I want my children and my children's children and their children to actually live in a place where every human being matters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, um, because we all have so much more influence on helping shape the future than we all realize. But it's that taking that step back and that pause and that mindset to be like, oh wow, like just even my little small acts contribute to the larger picture. And whether that larger picture is globally to the larger picture of family and friends and um and your local communities. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So with that, Leanne, do we want to move to book recommendations and top tips?
Absolutely. Let's have a look at that. So let me share my screen because that's always the tricky part of navigating multiple technologies, Jason. Here we go. So, our greatest act of courage, right, is illuminating humanity one small step at a time and one small story at a time. And here we've got some book recommendations in relation to cultural well-being. So the first one is The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And where am I? I haven't actually read this book, I have to say, so I can't speak too much to it. But it's a brilliant exploration, apparently, of how people from different cultures and communities lead and build trust. Perfect for understanding global workplaces and reducing cultural friction, especially when we've got this world that's so much more connected. And it offers practical frameworks for empathy and perspective taking and bridge building in cross cultural contexts, which is exactly what we've been talking about today. So the book is called The Culture Map by Erin Mayer.
Awesome. And I have not read that book either. Many books on today's list I have not read. So um, can give can give you some context, but I'm sure all of these books are available on Amazon, which is obviously a global deliverer of goods, um, and Audible too. So I'm more of an Audible person. Love it. But I love having the physical book in my house if I want to go and like turn to the page, right? Um, this second book called Think Again by Adam Grant. So Think Again encourages its readers to stay curious. Our theme word of the day: question their assumptions, and embrace humility in learning. Not in competence, but in learning, and the key ingredients of cultural well-being. And this book has a good fit to today's conversation because it promotes intellectual humility and the neuroscience of rethinking, which, when you think about it, is essential for dismantling bias, right? And fostering openness.
I love that. The neuroscience of rethinking. So not just thinking, but thinking different, right?
Yeah,
Um,
thinking
that
differently.
one's definitely on my to read list. The next one that we're going to speak about is Atlas of the Heart, and we've spoken about this book on a couple of podcasts now because Brene Brown is the research scientist but storyteller extraordinaire. And what this book talks about is the emotions and experiences that define what it means to be human and to understand emotions across cultures, which deepens connections. So it's a great book to understand, what am I feeling, but is everybody feeling? So that whole emotional literacy piece that helps us to build the bridges across those cultures.
Mhm.
And it ties directly to empathy, that we've spoken about at large over the last few podcasts, but today as well. And the language of belonging. So it really does foster that emotional intelligence and the well-being of ourselves and of our culture.
Yeah. Yeah. I love Brene Brown. I mean, she's just so amazing. I aspire to be like her. Um, and our final book recommendation for today's podcast episode on cultural well-being is Blind Spot, on hidden biases of good people. And it is by Mahazarian Banerjee and Anthony Greenwald. And this book really takes a deep dive into the psychology of bias and how well-intentioned people can unintentionally perpetuate stereotypes. I'll say that again: how well-intentioned people can unintentionally perpetuate stereotypes. Um, and it's a good fit for our conversation today because it helps you, um, who are tuning in live today, and those who will listen post the live, to recognize similarity bias, which we talked about at great length today in our conversation, and provides you tools to see beyond your and our automatic thinking, which I think plays beautifully into that statement in the Think Again is the neuroscience of rethinking. So thinking differently, thinking more deeply versus the automatic thinking. So this is another book that I'm definitely going to put onto my personal reading list as well.
Yeah, all three of them actually, except for Atlas of the Heart, only because I've already read it and did it as a book club, so I've read it twice. So 3 out of 4 have joined my book list, which is fantastic. I'm an avid reader. I love it. Um, and I think, if we can learn how to navigate the bias, how to rethink, and how to be mindful about, our cultural impact, we're going to have a significant impact on our world and the world,
Yeah.
collectively.
Yeah, and I
But
think, with these books, right, with everything that you just said, I think an add-on, which we talked a little bit about earlier in our conversation, is it'll help you to come up with those better questions to ask, right? Um, so so much good in all these books, and hopefully you will all find them interesting, and or even if one sounds interesting, to put that on your reading list.
yeah,
So
and
yeah. Oh,
maybe we should consider a global book club. But anyway, that's another
yeah.
conversation for another day. Let's talk about our top recommendations for today, the top tips from our conversation today, Jason. The first one I'll start with, which is lead with curiosity, not assumption. Don't assume, ask, don't assume, ask open questions. Tell me more about that. What does that mean to you or for you? The more that we can replace judgment with wonder, with curiosity, the more it activates empathy and quietens the bias in our brain, because curiosity and courage builds bridges where assumptions build walls. So be curious, lean into curiosity, and really lead with that. Whether it's leading your family, your organization, your community, it doesn't matter. We are leaders, and we need to lead with that curiosity and not with assumption.
Absolutely, which leads us beautifully into our second tip for today, which is practice cultural humility and be that lifelong learner. So, create that shift within yourself from I know to I'm learning, which creates a vast amount of openness. Listen deeply without needing to fix, to defend, to compare. Listen deeply, and you will understand so much more, which will help you craft those more curious questions, um, and a more curious response versus I need to fix this, I am defending my point of view, and or I'm comparing this to A, B, and C. So listen deeply, is the essence of being a lifelong learner and practicing cultural humility. And lastly, acknowledge your own blind spots, privilege, bias, spiritual preference, intergenerational norms and beliefs. We all have them. So acknowledge them, get to know them. And some will be like, you need to get off my stage. And then there's others who are like, you know what? Hey, come on to the stage. Let's have a little party here, and do some good in the world. And because awareness creates space for inclusion and respect at the end of the day. So, dig a little deep and get to know those blind spots in those different areas so that then you can open that space for inclusion and respect.
Yeah, I love that. Build bridges, and that leads to the third one, which is to build bridges through this shared concept of humanity. And I spoke about it earlier, but just to double click, look for commonalities, like look for common values before focusing on differences. Connection rather than and curiosity rather than coming up and having our fixed mindset. Because really it's the connection and the curiosity that unites us. The more that we can sit into that curious space, the more that we can lean into connection, the more that we actually have unity. And support and celebrate different voices, amplify, don't overshadow, like be mindful of how you're showing up. And remember the ripple effect. Small, tiny steps of empathy and openness and kindness can contribute to a global well-being phenomenon that we're trying to achieve. So curiosity opens the mind, humility opens the heart, and connection opens the world. And we really want to lean into that.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's look at our next episode. So can't believe, Leanne, that we're already on episode 8 this next week. It has been just so amazing on doing this podcast together, and just can't believe how fast the weeks have flown by. And that we're already on episode 8. So episode 8 is going to be on occupational and professional well-being. And the essence of it is will be about working with purpose and finding fulfillment in what you do. This is going to be an amazing episode. We may not, surprise coming, we may or may not have a guest expert that will join us in our conversation. And so it's going to be next Wednesday, uh, November, I was going to say January, November 19th, local time here in LA at 2:30 p.m. and Thursday, November 20th, Sydney at 9:30 a.m. And then the many different time zones around the world that are tuning in. So is there anything you want to say about next week's episode?
Yeah, I think finding your purpose and fulfillment um, is probably the key to the happiest life. And being able to have this conversation around aligning your purpose to the work that we do, like what drives you, and how can you carry that forward? I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be a fun one.
Yes, absolutely. So let's recap today's conversation, which I know has been a lot. We're almost at 2 hours, but we knew this was going to be a big conversation and lots and lots and lots to discuss in it. So, and we've really only touched the iceberg, really, or the tip of the iceberg in today's conversation. So with that, cultural well-being is about embracing difference, nurturing curiosity, and leading with humility.
And if the more that we can show up authentically with kindness and compassion, the more that we can do great things in the world. So thank you, everybody, and Jason, for this rich conversation. I have really enjoyed today's podcast and the topic that we've covered.
Yeah, and just remember, as always, we're here for you, and we hope that you're enjoying our content, and that we're here to walk alongside you and in conversation in this complicated thing called life that we all have to experience each and every day. But hopefully you find some deeper meaning in our conversations that Leanne and I are putting out there, and that it brings a little smile to your day, and hope for the immediate and long-term future.
Absolutely. We hope it sparks something new, a new insight, a fresh perspective, or even just a question that's worth exploring, because we love having the conversations with you and for you. So if you enjoyed today's episode, as always, share it, watch it, subscribe, like us, and keep the conversation going.
Exactly, because when we talk,
We really talk.
and anything is possible.
So let's talk.
With real conversations
And limitless possibilities. Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Thanks, everybody.
morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're calling in from. We'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week.